There are more than 30 million people in this world who identify themselves as Kurds. Half of them live in Turkey. Millions more are in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Their fate, and whether they should have a country of their own, has proved to be one of the most complex questions in all of geopolitical affairs. What should be done with and for the Kurds, and what role might Canada play? Let's ask Janice Stein, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and TVO's regular foreign affairs analyst. Janice, good to see you here again.
Nice to see you, Steve. And this is actually of deep interest to Canada.
It should be. Well, here's the 411 on the Kurds. For example, they are the fourth largest ethnic group in the Middle East. They are the majority in the semi-autonomous region of Iraqi Kurdistan. They have faced harsh treatment in Turkey for generations, where they make up 15 to 20% of that country's population. There are Kurdish nationalist movements championing increasing rights or the creation of an independent Kurdistan, and we'll dive into all of that now. Janice, is there a Kurdish problem that the world needs to solve?
Absolutely, there's a Kurdish problem. You just said, Steve, there are 20% of the population in Turkey, 20% in Iraq, 10% in Iran, and 10% in Syria, divided across 4 countries. And they have been pushing for independence for 100 years, since the post-World War I peace settlement. Things have never looked better for them than they do now. And why, off the top, should Canadians care? Almost everything that we have done in the struggle against ISIS has been focused on the Kurds. We have been a major supplier of advice and equipment to the Kurds in
all 4 countries?
No, to the Kurds in Iraq, and I suspect over the border in Syria as well. So without saying so, the Canadian government has made a bet on the Kurds, and not only the Harper government, but the Trudeau government as well.
Do you think the Kurds have a legitimate claim to their own country?
They do, in the sense that any major national group who self-identifies as a national group has a claim. Now, in Canada, this is a familiar argument. We've had this argument for the last 50 years in this country as well. So we always balance those claims against the cost. And we would be breaking up 4 states, right? This would be major surgery on northern Iraq, northern Syria. The Iranian Kurds are different from the Iraqi Kurds and the Syrian Kurds. They've always identified as Iranian.
So do they want an independent Kurdistan in which to live?
They have not spoken out in favor of an independent Kurdistan. They've been very careful not to do so, especially since 1979. There was, by the way, just for the historians in the room, as we say, there was a Republic of Kurdistan in Iraq in the immediate post-war period. The Turks...
Sorry, post-war, which war?
World War I.
Okay.
Okay, and the Turks squelched that. And the Turks, if anybody is opposed to an independent Kurdistan, it is, of course, the government of Turkey, which regards the militant wing of the Kurds, PKK, as a terrorist organization, and has stopped at nothing to stamp them out.
What's their opposition to an independent Kurdistan?
They regard this as part of historic Turkey. They are absolutely unwilling to consider and they're living this nightmare right this minute, the President Erdogan of Turkey, because there are now, and that's why I say this is the moment for the Kurds, there are now close ties between Kurds in Syria, which the world is supporting as they resist ISIS, and the Kurdish movement in Turkey. And President Erdogan is, there's no word to describe this, is apoplectic about these ties.
Is he concerned about the loss of territory?
He's concerned about the loss of territory. He's concerned about the loyalty of the Turkish Kurds, which may move toward formal identification with an independent Kurdistan. In northern Iraq, where there is the Kurdistan regional government in existence since 2003, set up by the United States and the coalition who opposed Saddam Hussein, they said they were going to hold a referendum. That word again resonates in this country. They're going to hold a referendum late last fall on independence, on an independent Kurdistan.
What happened?
They backed off.
But they run like a pretty much independent country already,
They
don't they?
have a fully autonomous regional government. And the more trouble that the government of Iraq currently finds itself in, the happier the Kurds are. When nobody was looking, they expanded just a little bit beyond traditional Kurdistan into Kirkuk. The city of Kirkuk, which has over 100,000 Kurds in it, also contains 13% of Iraq's oil. And the Prime Minister of Iraq has said Kirkuk is ours, and the Kurds say Kirkuk is ours. And you can just see the incendiary implications here of an independent Kurdistan in Syria, in Iraq, where it would probably spark the breakup of Iraq as a whole.
Well, is there an argument to be made that the aspirations of Kurds living in 4 countries in the region are actually okay the way they are right now? They are satisfied, maybe not the best, but it's satisfactory the way it is now.
So I think the reasonable way forward here is to look for middle ground, right? It is to affirm the Kurdistan autonomous regional government in northern Iraq and give them as much autonomy, as much right to opt out of every single arrangement in Iraq. The oil revenues in Kirkuk will be a huge problem. But other than that, to affirm that autonomy. In Syria, while the fight against ISIS has been going on, the Syrian Kurds have connected across the whole top of northern Syria. It's inconceivable to me, Steve, that any future arrangement that comes out of this awful civil war will not give the Kurds strong autonomy in northern Syria. So right away across that swath of Iraq and Syria, we are going to have 2 autonomous Kurdish regions, 2 provinces of Kurdistan, even though they may be embedded in Iraq and in Syria. Turkey is a different story. The stronger the Kurds get, the more alarmed President Erdogan gets, and this is now a major bone of contention in Turkish policy with the United States and with us, because we have chosen, and legitimately as our partners in the struggle against ISIS, Canada has chosen to support the Kurds as the most effective fighting force in the region.
But to support them, what? What's the outcome geopolitically we're looking for here?
We don't talk about this, right? So these are corridor conversations in Ottawa that people have, because when you talk about it formally, the answer is we are supporting the Kurds because they are the only force in this part of the world that is actually capable of resisting ISIS and that is motivated to fight for their territory, and that is true. Beyond that, well, we'll figure that out once the civil wars
So we have not actually said we are in favor of an independent Kurdistan, a new country.
We certainly have not.
We have not said that.
And Canada would be the last country to say that, given the fact that the federal government does not favor the same domestic arrangement at home. So there's no chance of that. However, what we're doing every day is actually paving the road to greater and greater autonomy for the Kurds, both in Syria and in Iraq.
So we are putting our thumb on the scale a little bit here.
More than a little bit.
More than a little bit.
We are putting our thumb on the scale, is what I would say.
Okay.
And I think the people who are doing it are well aware of what they're doing.
Who are the people who are doing it?
Well, these are, again, we've had 2 governments do this. So this is one of these rare bipartisan issues that come up. But who makes these decisions? These are senior officials in the Department of National Defense, in Global Affairs, in the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister's advisor on national security, and of course our ministers. And they certainly understood under the Harper government that by making this investment with the Kurds, they were strengthening the hands of the Kurds to bargain, first of all, against the government in Baghdad, and even more so, the government in Damascus by the Syrian Kurds.
So if everybody knows we're doing this, why don't we just come right out and say, you know what, the government of Canada someday would look with favor at the creation of an independent Kurdistan?
Because Canada, of all the governments in the world, is the strongest proponent of federal solutions anywhere, and the least inclined to support the redrawing of borders to recognize independentist movements.
All politics is local.
All
it
politics
really
is absolutely local.
In which case, if, let's look down the road, I don't know how many years, but if there were to be an independent Kurdistan established as its own nation, presumably made up of the populations of the 4 existing countries. What kind of a precedent would that set for foreign affairs?
Well, let's back up a little bit, Stephen, just talk about the map a little bit. Okay. If there is to be an independent Kurdistan, it will probably start in that northern tier of Syria and northern Iraq. And largely because those 2 countries are so fragile now and so disrupted that there is, again, a deep debate going on in most Western capitals about whether those 2 countries can be put back together again at all. Whether there's a future for Syria and whether there's a future for Iraq, they may break apart.
So that's an opening for a Kurdistan.
That is an opening for a Kurdistan. The Iranian Kurds will certainly be very reluctant to take risk. And in Turkey, the government would move with all the force that it has, and it has a very effective army to crush any attempt by the Kurds in Turkey to join such a Kurdistan.
But if geographically a future Kurdistan were just a remnant part of Iraq, a remnant part of Syria, would the Irani and Turkish Kurdish populations move into those areas?
I doubt that they would move. You know, you remember, the last time we saw a large-scale movement of Kurds was in 2003 when Saddam Hussein bombed those Kurds and they crossed borders into Syria and Turkey, and there was a massive refugee movement. It's very destabilizing for people to move out of their country. The Iranian Kurds are proud Iranians, so I doubt that they would move.
But the Turkish Kurds are being persecuted.
The Turkish Kurds are being persecuted, and there is, in fact, a resumption of the low-level civil war in the Kurdish area of Turkey, which has been going on for 30 years. So that's the open question. But we would be, as long as we understand what we're saying, destabilizing a fellow NATO ally. And we hear that from the president of Turkey all the time.
Let's look at each side of this coin then. What are the implications of not satisfying Kurdistan's or the Kurdish people's self-determination?
It would be a deepening of the status quo, in other words. And the deepening of the status quo is better than the Kurds have had in the last 100 years. If you can reinforce the autonomous region of Kurdistan in Iraq and create an autonomous region of Kurdistan in Syria, this would be a massive improvement for the Kurds. It's only since 2003, after almost 100 years, that they have any autonomous region. And it would avoid breaking up at least 2 states.
Okay.
That's the advantage of an enhanced status quo.
And the flip side is, what are the consequences of creating a new Kurdish homeland?
Well, creating a new Kurdish homeland would, first of all, satisfy what are clearly legitimate aspirations of Kurds in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. There's no question about that. Whether it would break up Iraq and Syria is an open question, because those 2 may break up on their own, but it would provoke a massive use of force by the government of Turkey and would put all the NATO allies in a really tough spot here, Canada particularly, because we've been at the forefront of providing military equipment and military advice to the Kurds. We are supporting a group that the Turkish government labels terrorist and a threat to the territorial integrity and stability of Turkey.
So it sounds like you're for status quo.
No, I'm for enhanced
status quo. Okay.
That's right.
Let's finish up on this sort of big picture overarching question here.
History moves slowly, but all that matters is it moving in the right direction?
Gotcha. Thus, enhanced status quo,
yes.
Not just status quo. What generates more geopolitical predictability in your view? Recognizing and assisting national self-determination movements, or suppressing such movements, or let's just say not helping such movements, in order to preserve stable relations with established states?
That's a terrific question that you asked, Steve, and I think it's contingent on the moment in history that you're in. If you would have asked that question 20 years ago, I think the uniform answer would be, all we can ask is that these 4 governments treat their Kurdish minority with decency and with respect. You know, in Turkey, for example, they weren't allowed to use the Kurdish language for years and years and years, nor were their children allowed to go to school and learn the Kurdish language. So we would have pushed for a rights agenda, but it would have been inconceivable that we would support any kind of autonomous regions. We are now 15 years into the breakdown of the Middle East. Syria is unrecognizable, and I am one of those people who does not believe that it can be put back together again. It's a reasonable option now, without huge cost, to continue to support the autonomous region of Kurdistan in northern Iraq and to press for the same arrangement in Syria. And I hope that our political leaders do so. But we will run up against the president of Turkey.
Fascinating. Janice, thank you.
Pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.